So I'm just starting to realise how good a gig I've got this morning because I get to introduce these people who I just respect. And so the next speaker is Sarah Pett from University College London. Sarah's a trained infectious diseases physician who was trained initially in the UK and then came to Sydney to have the rough edges knocked off her. And then worked at the Kirby through the 2000s, leading with Sean Emery and David Cooper some of the biggest trials that were run during that time. And then she's returned now to UCL to do further work in infectious diseases. And so it's with great pleasure I introduce Sarah Pett. Thanks, Sarah.
Right, I've got my specs on. We're all getting old, aren't we? Thank you very much to the organising committee for this opportunity to speak. It's a really great honour and privilege, and I have to say it's obviously with very heavy heart. So I'm going to hopefully work my slides. I'm just going to overview some of the ongoing challenges in HIV and TB in Africa. I'm going to talk about the key elements for building and sustaining research networks, and also what HIV and TB networks can achieve. And I'm just going to apologise in advance. I'm not really going to talk very much about HIV prevention efforts in Africa, so forgive me for that. So there are a number of obviously ongoing challenges in Africa, not least of which is that it's got the highest prevalence of HIV in the world. And that's 4%. The incidence rate is 1.2 million new infections in the region in 2016, and really worryingly, just over 250,000 new infections per year in adolescents. And adolescents are also doing badly compared to other age groups with respect to annual AIDS-related deaths. There's been an increase in mortality. And this is really of concern, and I think we need to focus our research efforts on this particular age group. So although there have been some fantastic achievements, so 57% of people on antiretroviral therapy, we still have a long way to go. We are on track to meet the SDG target for 100% on treatment by 2030, but there are lots of potential problems, particularly in the adolescent group. So turning our attention to the global burden of TB, I think these numbers are quite startling. So on the left-hand triangle, you can see the global burden of the different forms of tuberculosis. And in the right-hand triangle, the sort of prognosis, which is particularly poor, as you might imagine, from multi-drug resistant and XDR TB. So we really need to be doing better. And many research groups, including the group that I work with at UCL, they've really focused on broadening the TB research agenda across the age spectrum. So Africa has a high burden of tuberculosis with about 2.5 million cases in 2016. And there's quite a difference across different African countries with respect to incident rates, which are highest in South Africa with about 440,000 new cases in 2016. So I think the core sort of foundation for building and sustaining research networks, there are 5 main things: friendship, opportunity, funding, vision, and science. And I just want to walk you through the journey, actually, that the unit that I now work with at UCL has taken, and you'll see some real parallels with the Kirby Institute and the great leadership that David's shown to us over the many years. In 1988, Dame Janet Derbyshire, who's known to many of you, actually established the MRC HIV Clinical Trial Centre, which was set up from one of the old MRC TB units, which actually did the first streptomycin trial back in 1948, and was still going strong with TB, which perhaps just exemplifies the fact that we could have done better over the years with developing new drugs and so forth. But this was a direct response to the growing epidemic in Africa and built on the existing links with Southern and Eastern Africa, which remain very strong to this day. And it's these sort of countries in Africa that are the core of our HIV and broader infections research agenda. There were strong links with Australia that were forged with David, Ab, and Janet with some of the early studies in HIV and strengthened further through international collaborations, a randomized controlled trial like in Initio, which many of you remember and worked on, and also the INSIGHT studies with David, Sean, Janet, and Ab as founding members of this network, which has done extraordinary work over the last sort of nearly 2 decades. So going back to the MRC Clinical Trials Unit, was renamed in 1998 with the coming together of the infections research agenda, HIV and TB predominantly, and the cancer unit. And I want to come back to the idea of strengthening that collaboration with the Kirby in future. So in 2013, we became part of a new institute at UCL, the Institute of Clinical Trials and Methodology. And methodology has always been at the heart of the clinical trials unit's work, but has been strengthened further. And we've also broadened the infections research repertoire with more joining up of adult and pediatric studies. And I think that's something that obviously does need to happen more. The Kirby also has expanded its HIV research into Africa with trial sites in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and South Africa. So this is just a summary slide just showing what the sort of raison d'etre of the infections theme at the CTU is. And you can see many parallels with the Kirby's sort of raison d'etre and mission statement. And that's really to do research into infections which have a global public health significance. And we certainly focus our efforts in HIV, TB, malaria and sepsis in children, influenza, viral hepatitis, and increasingly more in antimicrobial resistance. So our work has to have the potential for major global impact and a clear need for our unit to be involved with that research. We certainly have a track record and core expertise in challenging trials, and I think many of you who perhaps know some of the trials at the clinical trial CTU know that we tend to build in sort of several different randomizations, trying to answer several questions of importance within the same trial, so maximizing efficiency. And also value adding in terms of methodological innovation and novel approaches. And also, I emphasize again, trying to include the full age spectrum in the trials. So one of the other core things that's been very important is capacity building between the North and the South and South-South capacity building. And the South-South, by that I actually mean Europe, the States and Africa. Could also mean with Australia as well, of course. And how have we done this and how do we sustain this? Well, I think the membership of disease consortia, guidelines groups has been really important. Being founder members of several research networks like INSIGHT, the PENTA, which is the big paediatric European network, Panacea, big TB consortium, and MDP, which is an HIV prevention network, has been really pivotal. Linking to other networks such as IMPACT, HPTN, and CDC TB Trials Consortium has been important to avoid duplication of research, and also has led to collaborations such as PEMPACT. And the scientific relationship with the pharmaceutical industry can also, has been very important, including generic companies. And without the donation of antiretrovirals and other drugs for the research, I don't think that we could have afforded to do many of the trials that have been done so far. So this is perhaps a very sort of bright slide. So this is to show you the DART, Arrow, CHAPAS, Chair family of clinical trial sites in Uganda, Zimbabwe, South Africa and Zambia. And in fact, our network has expanded to include sites in Kenya and Malawi and soon into Mozambique as well. I've also shown the many partners, including the funders, which are in the dark purple squares on the left-hand side, and the pharma companies who donated drugs, such as in the blue panel. So just to focus you on the DART study, which I think is really where we, I suppose, helped to capacity build the sites in Africa for future RCTs, which have had global impact and been guideline changing, both in the paediatric and adult setting. So DART, if you remember, was a huge strategy study over 6 years between 2003 and 2008, and actually enrolled 3,300 adults from 2 countries, so Uganda and Zimbabwe. And those patients were enrolled over about a year and maintained in follow-up for 5 years, with only a 7% loss to follow-up over that time. It enrolled HIV-infected symptomatic adults, and the median CD4 count of those patients was 86. And one of the key findings in DART was that antiretroviral therapy could be delivered safely without routine laboratory monitoring, particularly for toxicity. But there were some differences in disease progression, suggesting a role, at least for monitoring CD4 from the second year of antiretroviral therapy to guide the early switch to second-line treatment. And what this really meant was that antiretroviral therapy could be successfully delivered in a rural setting. So this avoided the need for patients to have to walk miles to a center which had a laboratory facility. Rather, they could have ART delivered locally. And also meant that you could spend less money on toxicity testing, which would mean that you could treat more people with antiretroviral therapy. I have to say there were some difficulties with the timing of the results. The primary results were published in The Lancet in 2010, and the launch of the WHO 2010 guidelines. So I think there were a lot of politics about the findings in DART. Anyway. There were similar findings in the ARROW study, which enrolled 1,200 children, and we learnt a lot about the long-term course of HIV and antiretroviral treatment in both adults and children from those 2 studies. But DART was obviously a huge study and really led to capacity building of the trial sites, independent monitors, mentoring of all of the operational staff at the sites, and helped to grow leadership in Africa through people getting their MSCs and PhDs and so forth. So turning our attention now to a study that we're all involved with through the Kirby, an enormous endeavor. And this is the START study, which really is one of the most high-impact randomized controlled trials ever conducted, and really showed us that antiretroviral therapy should be started without any regard for CD4 threshold, so start treatment straight away. And now all of the guidelines, thankfully, are in alignment, including those of WHO and so forth. So it really answered an important question about when is the right time to start antiretroviral therapy. I may add that perhaps the question had already been answered in children before it was answered in adults through the SHARE study, which you may be aware of as well. So interestingly, is a slightly different sort of paradigm for the clinical trial centres in Africa that participated in START. So there were several sites. They were actually under the jurisdiction of 3 different international coordinating centres based in London, at my unit, in Sydney, at the Kirby, and in the Washington ICC based in DC, and enrolled just over 1,000 patients across these sites, with many women involved, enrolled in the study, which is refreshing because women are often underrepresented in clinical trials in HIV, so it's very important. And despite these sites being under the jurisdiction of 3 different ICCs, it all still worked very well. So a different sort of model of clinical trial networks. Okay. And now I just want to turn my attention to a study that I have been very closely involved with, and that's the REALITY study. And this is a study that was conducted between 2013 and 2016 across 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa: Uganda, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. And our funders were MRC DFID Wellcome, and drugs were donated by the pharmaceutical companies listed on the bottom of the slide. And this was an amazing endeavor. I don't think I've ever been involved with such a complicated study, but we achieved it. And And I'll just walk you through some of the important findings of the study and some of the challenges. This was a study that was designed to try and affect a better outcome in people presenting with very advanced HIV. And unfortunately, still, particularly in Africa, about 25% of people still present with very low CD4 count. So it doesn't show any signs of that problem going away, despite the directive to start treatment early and so forth. So about 25% of people are presenting very late. And so using the information we gleaned from DART and ARROW with respect to we found out that there was very early mortality in the first sort of 12 weeks after starting antiretroviral therapy in people starting treatment with advanced HIV. And so we designed this study to try and I suppose think about different ways of affecting a better clinical outcome and trying to reduce this early mortality. So the study is a factorial trial. The patient population was HIV-infected adults, adolescents, and children aged 5 years, so across the age spectrum, naive to antiretroviral therapy with a CD4 cell count of less than 100. And in fact, the median CD4 of the 1,805 patients who enrolled in the study was around 37, so this is severely immunocompromised. So the first of the randomizations, and patients were all entered into the 3 randomizations, A, B, and C simultaneously, was to see if we intensified antiretroviral therapy with quadruple therapy, including an integrase inhibitor, for the first 12 weeks would make a difference to clinical outcome. The second factorial randomization was to give an enhanced anti-infection prophylaxis package consisting of cotrimoxazole, isoniazid, B6, fluconazole, 100 milligrams a day for 12 weeks, 5 days of azithromycin, and a single dose of albendazole compared to standard cotrimoxazole prophylaxis. And the last intervention was a macronutrient supplement with a replacement, a nutritional package called RUSF compared to usual nutritional support. The study had many challenges. As you can imagine, there were about 14 antiretrovirals that were provided by 5 different companies. And so that was challenging to make sure we didn't run out of any drugs at any time. There were also different taste differences for example, in Zimbabwe, RUSF is quite sweet, and the Zimbabweans didn't really like the taste of RUSF, but in Uganda, people have a sweeter tooth, so that was greeted very favorably. There's possibly some sharing of RUSF within families. And one of the other challenges was actually reviewing 923 clinical endpoints in a pretty short space of time. This is a 48-week study. And this was achieved by a fantastic endpoint review committee who reviewed all of the events blinded, so that we sort of tried to reduce the bias from the way they adjudicated on those endpoints. And so we were really greatly helped by, this is actually one of our key trial members. This is the Reality Bear. And this was the way in which we actually helped to train the sites to understand the factorial randomization using the 3 buttons on the Reality Bear to actually to teach what that meant, and the patients actually loved the Reality Bear as well. And he travelled with us, including to the final results meeting, which was held in Harare in May of 2016. So what did we learn from the Reality study? Well, it was only the enhanced infection prophylaxis package that actually made a clinical difference, and this showed us that there was reduced early mortality from 12.2 to 8.9%, and that's a significant finding. Reduced also adverse events and hospitalizations. And fortunately, the additional pill burden, which we were a bit worried about and might have a negative effect, did not adversely affect viral load suppression. So even though people were taking a lot more pills, it didn't affect their adherence to antiretroviral therapy. And also, we were able to get a fixed-dose combination made by Cipla of cotrimoxazole, isoniazid, and B6. And this was WHO pre-qualified in December of 2016. And the beauty of that FDC is it's quite small, and you can just give a half dose to children under the age of 12. So that's also an important, I suppose, spin-off of this study as well. So this is a very low-cost intervention, costing just $5.60 for the whole 12 weeks of this enhanced anti-infection preventative package, and this could save 3.3 lives for every 100 individuals treated. And whilst we still haven't quite persuaded WHO to endorse this enhanced anti-infection package, we're working on them, so watch this space. And the findings were published in New England Journal last year. So just in the last few minutes, to just turn attention to tuberculosis. This is really where the Medical Research Council Clinical Trials Unit started, and it's still where we are putting a lot of energy. So we've got 10 adult TB trials in our current quinquennium TB program, including latent TB. If you remember, more than 2 billion people globally have latent TB. And we have an extensive research network, including sites in South Africa, Uganda, and Ethiopia, and 3 paediatric phase 3 studies as part of our paediatric infections program. And so there's been some sort of joining up of our adult TB program and the paediatric program, which is long overdue. And those 3 studies are SHINE, SURE, and TB Champ, and I'm happy to talk about them after, in the tea break if you want to know more. But what's important is the STREAM study, which is a pivotal study in MDR-TB, and is actually the licensing study for bedaquiline, a new drug from Janssen, is now enrolling children aged 15 years and older, but we clearly do need a pediatric MDR-TB trial as well. So in conclusion, research networks are built on solid science, smart scientists, smart funders, and north-north, north-south, and south-south friendships and collaborations. Funding is a constant concern, and I think that all of us in the UK are really sick of the B word. What a disastrous vote. And EDCTP has been a really key funder for us at the CTU, and has enabled us to do a whole program of pediatric trials and the CHAPAS trials, and also the EARNEST study, which was a key study that informed on the management of first-line failure, along with the second-line study, which was conducted out of the Kirby. So those are 2 very important studies for second-line management. So I just had to put, we don't really know what's going to happen to EDCTP minus us lot. So current and future directions for the MRCCTU include expanding and building on the existing portfolio of HIV treatment and prevention studies. I think it's fair to say it's getting harder to get grant money for HIV research unless you focus your energy on adolescents. And there have been many calls in the last few months for work in adolescents specifically, because they're doing so badly compared to the other age groups. TB work continues. The newer areas of work include viral and bacterial respiratory infections, particularly the management of community-acquired pneumonia, management of severely sick children, sepsis and malaria, viral hepatitis. And infection cancer research is something that I think that we should really focus on as well. And certainly we've had a few meetings which were initiated by David, Sean, Mark Polizotto and myself to try and link the cancer group at the MRCCTU with work at the Kirby, and perhaps excitingly to try and create an HPV-related cancer network. And I think there's a real opportunity to do that. And I note that Unitaid just put out a call for research to reduce cervical cancer in low and middle income settings. So there are opportunities, and the funders are coming on board. Another neglected area is viral hepatitis related cancers, huge burden of disease, terrible prognosis. And I think that we could, perhaps do some really fantastic work together in that field. So I'd just like to acknowledge and thank the very many thousands of patients who have participated in the trials. I mean, really extraordinary contribution and legacy. To the infections group at the MRCCTU, who've welcomed me into their hearts, been there for 4.5 years, and really amazing support and friendship given to me by Sarah Walker, Di Gibb, Angela Crook, Andrew Nunn, and Ab Babaker. I'd like to just acknowledge and thank the fantastic TVRP teams at the Kirby, who was my great privilege to work with for many years, particularly Sean Emery and Kate Carey. I have to say something about MRC core funding, otherwise I'll be in trouble. And most of all, I had to leave this till the last. Okay, so just to thank David for being such an inspirational leader. I knew I'd do this. A mentor and friend. He was fantastically kind always to me, and especially when my own father died more than 10 years ago now. And I feel like I've lost my second father. So thank you.